So 2024 has come to a close, and I think it's very safe to say that Batman fans ate really good this year. You had the Penguin show, which not only did a perfect job of fitting into and continuing Matt Reeves' established Batman universe, but it actually managed to make the Penguin a very unique and compelling character. Then you had Batman Arkham Shadow not only being a really good VR game, but it definitely managed to get the bad taste out of everybody's mouth after the fiasco that was Suicide Squad Killed a Justice League. Then you had the Absolute Batman comic book series, which managed to reinvent Batman's origin in a way that still was very, well...
You look like you ate Bane!
And then you had Batman Caped Crusader. This one was a little bit more of a mixed reception. I personally found it to be rather dull and boring during many points, and I also didn't feel that certain characterizations were really in line with what I would like to see out of Batman. But one thing that most people seem to agree on about this series, or at least its first season, is that it shed some spotlight on some more obscure Batman and DC villains, such as Nocturna, Gentleman Ghost, and Onomatopoeia. And after thinking a little bit on whom I would like to see in the show, I decided why not make a video where I tell all of you good folks whom I believe to be the 14 most underrated Batman villains of all time. Okay, so tell me if this has happened to you. You're planning on murdering somebody or robbing a place. Everything is all planned out, but then you realize that you've forgotten the most important part. Who the hell is going to clean up the crime scene? That is where the eraser comes in. Now, looking at this guy, you'd be forgiven for not thinking of him to be a fighter, let alone a main antagonist. But what I think is so very interesting about the Eraser is that while he's not necessarily the most dangerous criminal that there is to be found in Gotham, one could argue that he would be one of the most valuable and important. You see, the Eraser's nom de guerre derives from the fact that he erases evidence from a crime scene. And so, as you can imagine, in the crime-infested streets of Gotham City, this meticulous attention to detail would probably be a very hot commodity in the criminal underworld. However, I do get why he's not really utilized that much. His eraser head helmet is the object that erases things, like just deletes them from reality or whatever. It's not really clear how it works. Also, he has these giant shoes that emit knockout gas or something.
What the fuck, y'all? God damn!
I think that if you just simply kept it at a yellow pinstripe suit and maybe a pink flap top, that would be more than enough of an iconic look for him. But seriously, wouldn't this guy know the ins and outs of all of the worst crimes committed in Gotham? What if he knew all of the other rogues' weaknesses based on how well they leave clues and evidence lying around? Goodness knows he probably makes a ton of money just keeping quiet about stuff. You can have him be like those hackers that will break into a security system or network and then sell their services back to the administrator saying, hey, if this is how easy it is for me to hack in, I can help you make it unhackable. Or he could be like a reverse Sherlock Holmes that leaves fake clues to throw Batman and other vigilantes off the scent. Certainly would be a much more interesting gimmick than Clue Master. If you want to commit crimes in a city where crime is the norm, you have to get creative. Stealing, rape, and murder are all classics to be sure, but there's something about immortalizing all of it that adds an extra level of delicious evilness to all of it. Enter Film Freak, stage left. Now, if you can believe it, the name Film Freak has actually been used twice by two different guys over the course of Batman's history. The first Film Freak was this bald dude named Burt Weston, which, if you can't already tell, is an amalgamation of the Batman and Robin actors Adam West and Burt Ward. And he modeled his crimes after scenes from famous movies and often quoted them. I personally don't think that this really vibes well with the DC universe. The whole idea of referencing specific real-world pop culture artifacts is kind of more of Marvel's shtick. I think that DC should be a bit more of a pulpy facsimile of the real world rather than just a direct reference to it. Now, the second Film Freak, this is the guy I want to get to. He was this goth dude named Edison, and he was supposed to be an homage to late night horror movie hosts like Vincent Price, the Crypt Keeper, and Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. and he liked kidnapping people and capturing his evil acts upon them on camera. I think the big takeaway or theme of both film freaks is that of modernity and hyper-reality. How people can get so lost in fictional media that they start to let it affect how they see and interpret the real world, and all of a sudden they start getting itchy over how their lives don't feel like they're following a 3-act structure, or that their life is a show with lousy season finales, or that it's not as interesting or exciting or as glamorous as how it's depicted by other people on social media. When you pair the lethal combination of easy-to-access technology and the relentless chasing of fame, you can get lots of people, both real and imaginary, to do unconscionable acts. Now, it just so happens that there's also a very similar villain called the Director, who has also had 2 iterations, who wants to create a superhero snuff film. And honestly, I don't see why these 2 concepts can't be married together. I could totally picture a scenario similar to the Saw films or the infamous video game Manhunt, where Film Freak wants to record people going through some terrifying maze or labyrinth or house of horror, kind of like a cross between H.H. Holmes or McCamey Manor.
For me, it's about making that special Kodak moment. I am always thinking of it as a cinematic experience.
Or maybe have them fight against each other like in bum fights, and then sell these videos on the black market, all while using his persona to do these creepy intro and outros.
The hour for nightmare is once again at hand.
Now, when I say the name The Circus of the Strange, you're all probably immediately thinking of Professor Pig. In fact, I referenced these 2 in my last video about who I would like to see in an upcoming Matt Reeves Batman film. But I'm not talking about him in this case. In fact, he's not even factoring at all. I am talking specifically about a collection of circus freak-themed criminals. While it may be a harsh word to describe them, the fact of the matter is that the circus freak has existed with our own world across cultures and across centuries. It only stands to reason that should they be abused or downtrodden long enough, they would want to band together and probably enact revenge. And if, let's say, a circus is closed or is in need of funding, it would also stand to reason that they could use their bizarre physiognomy or abilities in order to commit crimes and attain money. What's interesting about the Circus of the Strange is that they are already born with their abilities, as opposed to having gained them through gadgetry or freak accidents. You can have a giant fat lady, you can have Siamese twins, you can have Dr. Phosphorus, whose head is constantly on fire, kind of like those fire spitters, and you also got a wolf boy. In fact, you could also probably incorporate other villains like Ragdoll or Killer Croc. And while they may not be on par with Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants, they are a macabre but still perfect fit for the type of social commentary that you often see in Batman comics. So Batman, more than any other superhero I can think of, has lots and lots of evil copycats. There's Prometheus, Owlman, Catman, and even in a meta way, Red Hood. However, as far as Black Mirrors are concerned, I think the best version of this is Killer Moth. The reason for that is very simple. Whether or not he's portrayed as inept or competent, what sets him apart from those other guys I mentioned is that he goes out of his way to assist lowly crooks in their fight against law enforcement. Unless, of course, we're counting that time he got turned into an actual Mothman, which, come to think of it, should be his name to begin with, since it's connected with the famous cryptid. In fact, Mothman should be scary. You can't tell me that while lurking through a dark alley at night and seeing these big red shiny eyes and bug-like appearance, you wouldn't shit your pants. I find it kind of fascinating how Batman is not only Killer Moth's greatest nemesis, but also his greatest inspiration. Everything he does is Moth-themed, much in the same way that Batman's is Bat-themed. And I'm kind of surprised that this hasn't led to more interesting stories about the battles between the two, but from Killer Moth's perspective.
Our battle will be legendary.
I don't even know who you are.
Maybe every time Batman gets a new costume or sidekick, Killer Moth then replicates that. What would a Moth family be like? We have the Court of Owls. Why not an eclipse of moths? No, seriously, an eclipse of moths. That's the word. How cool is that? You think that for a guy who fights as many crazy nut jobs as Batman does, it's only a matter of time before some religious zealot gets into the mix. Deacon Blackfire is a cult leader who served as the main antagonist during Batman: The Cult. Now, one of the main things about Deacon Blackfire is that he seems most intent on bringing his message to the homeless population of Gotham. Not simply because they're more vulnerable and less fortunate, but also because if they were to, let's say, go missing for any particular reason, no one would notice that they were gone, which plays into later. He not only manages to amass large numbers of people to follow him, but at one point manages to convince Batman into joining as well. While that last part may make it sound like Deacon Blackfire is only really good for one type of story, I think that the real weakness of Deacon Blackfire's character is also his greatest strength, and that is his similarity to another of Batman's more famous villains, Ra's al Ghul, Raish, whatever. You see, part of Deacon Blackfire's shtick is that he claims to be well over 100 years old, and that his longevity is maintained through bathing and drinking and consuming the blood of various sacrificial people. Not really like a vampire, but more like a crazy shaman. And sure, that could be a ruse to gain his cult following because real-life cult leaders are notorious for this kind of behavior. I think that having him actually attain mortality similar to Ra's al Ghul in the Lazarus Pit, but without it being the Lazarus Pit, makes him extremely dangerous. I mean, hey, why should Ra's get to have all the fun? Now I know what you're thinking. Roxy Rocket, clearly this guy is secretly Paul Dini in disguise. Well, I can assure you that that is most definitely not the case. So Roxy Rocket debuted in Batman the Animated Series. Or rather, the comic based off of the animated series, based off the comic, and her motif is simple. She is a former stunt woman who not only commits crimes, but is also addicted to the thrill of putting her life in danger. Now, while that might seem rather one note, there's actually, I think, a lot of really great potential in her character here. So the big selling point to her character is that she rides a giant rocket, rather suggestively, I might add. So why not have her use other fast modes of transportation as well? Give her a jetpack, or a helicopter, or a jet ski, or some kind of super fast racing car like they gave her in the Black and White comic. When you couple this with her quasi-diesel punk Amelia Earhart inspired design, you have what is essentially an evil version of those cheeky pinup girls from World War II. Maybe throw a little bit of rockabilly motifs in there for good measure. Would easily be a fan favorite among the cosplay community, I'm sure. Batman always has lots of cool ways to get around, so maybe someone else should give him a run for his money. Personally, I think it would be really fun to have her be sort of a go-to getaway driver for all of the different villains and criminals in Gotham. With no particular loyalty to any one mission or client unless if the pay was exceedingly great, or if the challenge was incredibly daunting, making her not only an enemy of Batman and the law, but also to other villains. I mean, who doesn't love themselves a sexy anti-villainess, am I right, fellas? So few villains in comics, including the ones in Batman's Rogues Gallery, can boast having such a shtick that is so equal parts hilarious and spooky than a gangster puppet and his ventriloquist handler. Like an aide pushing him around in a wheelchair, the ventriloquist presents himself as a soft-spoken nerdy guy, a great contrast to the violent, cantankerous dummy that is Scarface. According to most comics, the puppet Scarface was carved from a tree that was used to hang people from in a prison yard, and was made by some guy who shared a cell with the man who would become the ventriloquist. That man in a sort of Gollum and the One Ring type of fit, killed him and then possessed Scarface for himself.
Poor Donegan. It was an accident. Like the last time.
And so one really wonders if the puppeteer is projecting his dark side into the dummy, or if the dummy is actually possessed by the souls trapped inside the tree. While either way is certainly frightening on its own, I am more interested in a rather humorous aspect of the ventriloquist, or rather just Scarface. You see, the whole idea about Scarface is that he's supposed to be a cartoonish model of a gangster, since it's supposedly, what the ventriloquist thinks is what a cool badass guy would supposedly look or appear or act like. And so I'm thinking, why not have Scarface, the character, have different looks to him? Maybe one day he'll be wearing a tuxedo like in The Godfather. Maybe one day he'll be wearing a tracksuit like in The Sopranos. Or maybe one day he'll be wearing like a Hawaiian shirt like in Vice City. Because he's a ventriloquist dummy, right? He's kind of like a doll. You dress him up. I don't know. I just really think it's funny, the idea of him asking the ventriloquist to help him get on clothes every day. So let's say you're writing a Batman story, and you're thinking of maybe using either Harley Quinn or Catwoman. You want to do a bit of crazy like Harley, but the problem with her is that she's way too overexposed these days. Or maybe you want to go with something a bit more sultry like Catwoman. But Catwoman is really just an anti-hero now anyway. She's not going to be stealing from anyone unless they're somehow the real bad guy.
I see it more like teaching them a lesson.
Or you could take the middle ground and go with Magpie, a kleptomaniac who is obsessed with all things shiny. With her, you get the best of both worlds. A little bit of sexy burglarizing with a little dash of crazy psycho bitch. Now, Magpie the character has had a fantastic glow up over the last several years, probably the biggest one since Mr. Freeze. Ever since she was reinterpreted and redesigned in Beware the Batman, this one specific look has now been featured everywhere, from Gotham to Batwoman to even the new Penguin TV series. Certainly a lot better than whatever the hell this monstrosity is supposed to be. I also think it would be cool to add one of those Scaramouche masks on it, because, she's a bird, so it would be cool to let her have some kind of beak. Or maybe one of those flapper headdresses that has the little feathers in it and a bunch of little pearls and other little bits of shiny. But as was mentioned previously, she could possibly be a rival to either Selina, Harley, or both.
Ouch! You're quick.
With how desperately they're trying to turn Harley into an anti-villain, it's nice to have a more traditional villainess who's someone who just does bad things because they either gotta or they wanna. All while looking pretty damn sexy, if I do say so. Seriously, there's no way that the people in charge of Beware the Batman didn't know exactly what they were doing here. Now, this is a villain who should by all means be a bigger name. This guy's got everything a good Batman villain needs. A cool costume and name, a tragic backstory, a motif that not only fits the story of Batman, but it also is fairly timeless as well. And best of all, he's just crazy enough to get into Arkham. Porter Vito, which sounds like a type of wine, has been working tirelessly to create a means to resuscitate his dead parents. You know who else has dead parents?
My parents are dead!
But seriously, a man who can possibly control an army of dead or near-dead zombie-like people sounds like the perfect villain for a character like Batman. And not only a villain for Batman, but also a potential ally for characters such as Scarecrow, Ra's al Ghul, possibly even Solomon Grundy. I'm willing to bet Mr. Freeze would like to have a conversation with him. Also, I appreciate the Mortician for giving what is possibly one of my all-time favorite panels in all of comics. Okay, so I'm gonna be honest. When I first heard about Duella Dent, the so-called Joker's daughter, I couldn't help but roll my eyes and think to myself, that's gotta be like one of the most self-insert fan-fiction-y things I've ever heard. And after the recent debacle that is the CW show Gotham Knights, which featured Duella as a main character, I couldn't help but think that she was just a knockoff Harley Quinn. And while that may or may not be true, it did occur to me that everything they're currently doing with Harley Quinn, from converting her into being non-straight to trying to redeem her in character, to all of the wacky multiversal hijinks should have instead been given to Duella Dent. And here's why. So Duella Dent herself is a very complicated character due to her history. She initially started out as a generic criminal of the week who did masquerade as the daughter of the Joker. Later on, we would go on to remember her as the actual daughter of an alternate universe version of the Joker, where he's a good guy. And then in the modern era, we would get her as, once again, a villainess who thinks they're the offspring of the Joker, but this time they're a lot more violent and psychotic. Oddly enough, the Batwoman TV show actually had a fairly nuanced take on her, in that they made her this girl who had severe physical dysphoria about her face and her body, and so she ends up cutting up her face in a way that's very gruesome and disturbing. And I think it's interesting how we often joke about how Heath Ledger's Joker is meant to be all about, oh, we live in a society, whereas this almost female version of Heath Ledger's Joker in the self-inflicting of the scars actually does provide that. And I also think that the idea of her character sort of sheds light on how a lot of young people feel very aimless and alone, and so they want to try and embody these superficial trappings of their heroes and idols, making it this really sad and depressing craving for identity and belonging. And I'm thinking to myself that a psychopath who is convinced that they're the offspring of an already famous villain is kind of neat. Like, her mind is sort of this roulette of which villain am I supposed to be the heir of today? Almost like her mind is a choose your own adventure story, but it's working backwards. Kind of like when Joker famously said in The Killing Joke,
If I'm going to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice.
and because she believes that she's a different daughter of a famous villain each time, when she is in that role, she would kind of switch things up a bit. So if one day she thinks that she's the offspring of the Riddler, suddenly she'll start doing similar crimes. And the more villains appear in Gotham, the more get added to her list. If anything, the moniker Orphan shouldn't go to Cassandra Cain. It should go to Duella. They say there are only two certainties in life, death and taxes. And so therein lies the question.
Is it too much to ask for both?
The Tally Man is a bounty hunter who takes his job very seriously. And like many Batman villains, the man has a very tragic past. But his costume and design don't really say so. The guy wears a top hat, a cape, a cravat, seemingly meant to dress like an old school tax collector. And he sports this giant toothy grin along with two revolvers. And he's often drawn with this Todd McFarlane type of art style, the way his cape wraps around him. But just on his visual design alone, I actually think it is interesting because it can sort of be evocative of a folk tale. He's an enforcer for hire who always comes to collect your debts, and so he kind of operates the way a boogeyman or a Krampus does. You know, when your parents would tell you that you have to do this, that, and the other, or else a bad guy would come get you. But probably the thing that bugs me most about Tallyman is, well, he's kind of redundant. I mean, who else does he remind you of?
My name is Victor Zsasz.
Victor Zsasz started out having a lot of money, but threw it all away in gambling and was left in humongous debt. Victor Zsasz has tally marks all over his body. I mean, what are we doing here, DC? I mean, look at how he was in the Gotham show. He was exactly the type of character that the Tally Man is. I just really don't like redundant villains, and I think that if they just simply made Victor Zsasz and the Tally Man one character, that would go so far to elevating his status. So now we're getting another villain that I mentioned in my previous Batman villains video. Out of all the villains on this list, Anarky is easily and obviously the most politically charged, and thus has no shortage of motivation behind his actions. His villainy is fueled by an evergreen ideology that goes against that which the overwhelming majority of superheroes stand for: law and order. But what makes Anarky very interesting to me is that he's usually portrayed as being fairly young, oftentimes a teenager.
You're just a kid.
So, what does it matter? I wanted to make a difference.
thought you'd feel the same.
In my previous video regarding Anarky, I sort of alluded to the idea that he could be a person whom Batman would proposition to become Robin, but Anarky would say no. Or possibly be Robin for a while and then betray Batman and become a villain who is now trained in his tactics. So in addition to Batman, I think Anarky could also serve as an arch nemesis to either Nightwing, the Robins, or the Teen Titans. In a strange way, he's quite similar to the Joker in that he has this desire to cause chaos and mayhem. However, this comes with an agenda to strike against Gotham's institutions and the powerful elites who run them. Needless to say, Bruce Wayne has every reason to be concerned. We even saw stuff like this, not just in The Dark Knight with the Joker, but also in The Dark Knight Rises.
And we give it back to you, the people.
Things have not changed much since, and I think now would be the best possible time to bring Anarky into the mainstream.
And giving it back to you, the people.
Batman the Animated Series is not only well known for giving us many innovative reinterpretations of established characters, but also for creating new and original characters that would, later on, be introduced into mainline comics and other related media. But while Harley Quinn, Renee Montoya, and even the aforementioned Roxy Rocket have had a fair amount of success, Baby Doll has been relegated to only a tiny handful of cameos. But in an ironic twist, this do-batter stands head and shoulders above all the others in terms of untapped potential. Big things often come in small packages after all. Like many villains, Baby Doll is a very tragic character. Born with a genetic disorder that prevents her from aging, Mary Louise Dahl got cast as the star of an old-school family sitcom as the young daughter, but after her show gets canceled, she has nowhere left to go since no other productions will hire her. And because no one can think of anything else to do in Gotham, she turns to a life of crime. In a strange way, she's in a very similar situation to Bruce Wayne though. Bruce cannot fully move on from the childhood that he experienced, whereas Baby Doll cannot physically grow past her childhood. There is one thing about her that I also think makes her very interesting, and that is, out of all of the villains in the cartoon, she is probably the one who came the closest to truly reforming themselves. And I think such a character who actually does make a point to truly reform themselves, as opposed to someone like Harley Quinn who is quite irredeemable and yet DC keeps trying to shoehorn this idea onto us. I don't know, I just feel really bad for her. I mean, how can you not? Look how cute she is, she's so small! And as a potential reformed villain, I think that this would make her a very valuable ally to Batman. I actually had an idea for Baby Doll wherein, out of gratitude towards Batman for helping her go straight, she goes on to work at Bruce's mansion as a maid alongside Alfred, with a little bit of contention going on between her and the other members of the Bat family. But in the meantime, she's just such an adorable little villain, isn't she? And now, before I tell you whom I believe to be the most underrated, there are some honorable mentions, because of course a countdown like this has to have some. So the first honorable mention is Black Mask. I think that if the past several years of Batman media have proven anything, it's that the people at DC's television and video game departments love shitting on Black Mask, and it's very unfair. I probably don't need to tell you, the viewer, this, but they have a very long history of hyping up Black Mask as this super badass dude, and then right when the moment comes, absolutely humiliating and embarrassing him. He got shafted in Batman Arkham Origins, dishonorably executed in Arkham Knight, humiliated in the Gotham TV show, got blown up with a rocket in Death in the Family, and was portrayed as a total Fruit Loop in the Birds of Prey movie. When in reality, Black Mask is a really scary badass dude. He's a tough-as-nails gangster who not only gives the likes of the Penguin a run for their money, but also does it while wearing an awesome mask from the wood of his father's coffin. For a mask made out of wood, that is pretty fucking metal. The next honorable mention is one you probably might not have heard of, and that is Doodlebug. Daedalus Bosch, aka Doodlebug, is very similar to Film Freak insofar as he sees his crime as a work of art. But the key difference is that Bosch, as an artist, likes to turn his victims into art supplies. Blood instead of paint, skin instead of canvas, etc. And I think that this has lots of room for some really cool stories. You've got a psychopathic serial killer who kills people for creative reasons. And we've seen this everywhere, from characters like Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs in his woman suit, Sander Cohen from BioShock in his Quartic, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac and his Big Red Wall, the movie Velvet Buzzsaw, and The House That Jack Built. I also think it's rather clever how he's modeled after Jean-Michel Basquiat, but his name is sort of a reference to Hieronymus Bosch, who painted those now infamous portraits of what hell looks like. Also, I just think there needs to be more diversity among Batman's rogues. Speaking of, the next is Johnny Karaoke. I just really like the idea of a musical-themed villain who sings as he fights you. And I don't think it's at all weird considering how much of a massive success the Music Meister was in the Brave and the Bold cartoon. I also like to imagine that his character is sort of a not so subtle reference to the Stuck in the Middle with You scene from Reservoir Dogs. And this guy was also almost a mainstream entry. If you remember the guy from Batman Arkham Knight who did that Frank Sinatra bit, that's basically Johnny Karaoke, except it's a white dude and he's infected with Joker blood, which makes him crazy. But there's actually more to Johnny Karaoke's character going on that I think many of the writers might have even noticed. You see, Johnny Karaoke is a man who is caught between two worlds. The character is obviously Japanese, but he sings in a distinctly American style. His name is English, his last name Japanese. Also, his assistants, the geisha girls, are named after both the traditional geisha of Japan, but they also have the girls part of their name, as in Riot Girls, the female punk rock scene. Also, the name geisha girls was a term used to describe prostitutes in post-war Japan who appropriated the geisha aesthetic in order to entice American soldiers. Also, you got the Yakuza games, which are really popular, and there are a ton of musical segments in that. And of course, karaoke is a very fun pastime that pretty much originated out of Japan. So yeah, let's use more of Johnny Karaoke. In fact, now that I think about it, he would probably be a fantastic fit for a Caped Crusader Season 2. And the last honorable mention is Mime. I just think she's cute. Now sure, we already have two clown-themed villains with Joker and Harley Quinn, but I don't think it's at all weird to include a mime-based one simply because there's a lot of crossover and overlap between the two, while at the same time having both things be very different. In fact, not only are they still very different, but I think that we as Americans kind of exoticize mimes as much as we want to believe that they're annoying and lame. They're just so European. They're slimmer, they're more understated in their dress, they're, for lack of a better word, kind of sexier than clowns. But at the same time, they're also kind of scarier. After all, mimes make zero noise, they don't talk to you even when they're looking you dead in the eye, and they seem to be able to see and touch things that, by all accounts, are not really there. Also, I can't help but wonder if Echo from Gotham was partially inspired by her, considering how she doesn't talk, or perhaps partial inspiration for the character of Punchline. You know, like I said earlier, I really don't like redundant characters, and so they should all just be mushed together into one single character. I mean, really, Marvel and DC should just clean house by just amalgamating as many characters as possible. And now, for my number one most underrated Batman villain, I am, of course, referring to the wonderful, the magical, the incomparable, the most splendiferous and frabjous of all Batman villains, the Mad Hatter. Now, you may be wondering why it is that I consider Mad Hatter to be the most underrated. You got a moment? Because I could talk about this for quite a while. One of the big reasons why Batman has such an iconic rogues gallery is because the majority of his most well-known villains are magnifications of a specific character trait within Batman's psyche. Mad Hatter, at least to me, is a reflection of Batman's need to create a sort of fantastical reality of the world in which he is in complete control of both himself and others.
Welcome to Wonderland, Batman!
After all, Batman's origin story is that his parents were gunned down in an alleyway by a criminal and he was powerless to stop it. So what does he spend his evenings doing? Fighting criminals in alleyways so that he always wins this time. And Jervis Tetch does basically the same thing except through mind control, hypnosis, and hallucinogens. Combine this with his love for Alice in Wonderland and you get a nice, happy medium between Joker and Scarecrow. Joker is crazy, Riddler is calculating, and Scarecrow is sadistic, but Mad Hatter is very romantic and creative. He's also a little bit more sympathetic in that he has a lot of issues with unrequited love. Another thing that I think is very interesting about Mad Hatter is that it sort of encapsulates the dark side of fandom and obsessing over fictional characters. Mad Hatter is a very lonely and mentally unstable individual, and so he throws himself into the world of fiction where he imagines that he is among peers who don't really exist. Although this does lead to him having probably the most iconic set of henchmen out of all of Batman's villains, because they're all modeled after characters from Alice in Wonderland. You have Tweedledum and Tweedledee, March Harriet, you have the Unicorn and the Walrus, you have the Carpenter, you even have Cheshire Cat. But of course, he's always trying to find a woman to play the role of Alice. This is usually meant to be played off as him wanting a romantic partner that quickly spirals into obsession, even kidnapping and worse crimes. Speaking of, I don't really like it when they try and make Mad Hatter edgy or topical by having him being a pedophile or an incel. That to me is just a way too cheap and gross way to write what could be a very complex character. What I do think would be really, really good for Mad Hatter's character is if he ventured off a little bit beyond Wonderland, dipping his toes into other literary waters. Do some stuff with Mother Goose, Edgar Allan Poe, Hans Christian Andersen, the Brothers Grimm, maybe even a little bit of H.P. Lovecraft in there. I know there's already characters like Dr. Aesop and the Bookworm, but if you combine these all together and let him move and venture into other aisles of the library, have him base more of his plots and schemes around other notable works of children's literature, or heck, even genre fiction as well, like maybe Penny Dreadfuls, or, gothic romance, or even stuff like The Wizard of Oz. You would turn a one-trick pony into an endless treasure trove of ideas and possibilities. I just don't like redundant characters. He's also probably the most mainstream Batman villain who, to this date, has not received a live-action film adaptation, so what are you waiting for, James Gunn? What are you waiting for, Matt Reeves? TikTok. I'm sorry, I tried to do an Alice in Wonderland thing there, but what are your favorite Batman villains who do not get anywhere near the amount of attention they deserve? Which Batman villains do you think have been done the dirtiest by the various creative teams in comics, movies, television, video games, etc.? Let me know down in the comments. I would love to commiserate with all of you. If you enjoyed this video, definitely like, comment the whole bit, but it would greatly help if you were to support me on Patreon. That is the best way to help this channel grow, and definitely the best way to get more videos out there. And as always, this is Jay Brad, signing out.